The sun was just beginning to dip behind the rolling hills of my 40-acre ranch when I finally settled into my camping chair by the lake. A light breeze rippled across the water, and the golden hour silence was perfect. No sirens, no traffic, no radio static. Just me, my thermos of coffee, and the chirping of crickets. After 25 years in law enforcement and 5 as the chief of police, moments like this were rare and sacred. I had bought this piece of land 3 years ago, a tucked-away retreat an hour outside the city, complete with a spring-fed lake, dense tree lines, and not a soul in sight. Or so I thought. The idea was simple, a night of solitude, away from duty. I had driven my old Jeep out with a pop-up tent, portable grill, and a cooler full of steaks. My phone was off, and I was fully disconnected. Just a man and his land. Then came the sound, tires crunching gravel. At first, I thought maybe it was a neighbor checking in or just turning around. But the shiny black SUV that came into view wasn't here to chat. A neatly dressed woman stepped out, clipboard in hand, her expression somewhere between disapproval and determination. She didn't introduce herself right away. Instead, she stood with hands on hips, eyes narrowed like she was assessing damage. "Sir," she said sharply, "you're not permitted to camp here." I blinked. "Pardon?" "This land is part of the Twin Pines HOA," she continued, glancing down at her clipboard. "And per Section 12, subsection B, no temporary structures or overnight stays are allowed without prior written approval." I tried not to laugh. "Ma'am, this isn't part of any HOA. I own this land outright. It's zoned agricultural residential, unrestricted." She tilted her head. "Your plot may have originally been unrestricted, but when Twin Pines expanded in 2022, several peripheral properties were incorporated for shared lake access and visual integrity standards." I stared at her. "You're telling me the HOA thinks it can tell me what to do on my private lake?" She smiled politely, as if she was used to explaining rules to difficult people. "It's not personal. I'm simply here to enforce the guidelines. I've already contacted the sheriff's department." I stood up slowly, dusting off my jeans. "You called the cops on me. For camping on my own land?" "Correct," she said, nodding. "We have a duty to maintain community standards." I was about to correct her when I saw the cruiser pull up. It was one of ours, a city unit, not county. Interesting. I recognized the young officer stepping out immediately. Officer Jenkins, a good kid, 2 years on the force. He looked surprised to see me. "Chief?" he asked, glancing between me and the HOA woman. "Evening, Jenkins," I said, arms crossed. The woman's eyes widened. "Chief?" "Yes, ma'am," I said, retrieving my ID from my jacket. "Chief Marcus Ellis, City Police Department." The silence that followed was rich and uncomfortable. Jenkins scratched his head. I got a report of unauthorized camping and trespassing." "On property registered to me," I said calmly. "Deeds in the glove box, if anyone's curious." The HOA rep took a step back, suddenly not so confident. I wasn't aware." "Clearly," I said, more amused than angry. "Now, unless there's been an actual crime committed, I suggest everyone relax. Jenkins, thanks for coming out, but I think we're good here." He nodded, trying not to smile, and the HOA rep mumbled something about needing to review the updated boundaries before retreating to her SUV. As the tail lights disappeared down the road, I chuckled and sat back down by the lake. So much for a quiet night. But at least now I had a story. There's something about setting up camp that brings out a childlike satisfaction in me. Maybe it's the memory of my dad teaching me how to build a fire, or maybe it's just the appeal of working with my hands instead of wrangling city bureaucracy. Either way, the simple rhythm of pitching a tent and prepping a site feels more like therapy than effort. I had arrived at the ranch late afternoon, the sun warm but not punishing, and the air clean in that way only rural Texas air can be. My lake, a quiet horseshoe-shaped body of water, surrounded by a patch of oak and pine, reflected the blue sky like glass. It was early summer, dragonflies buzzed low near the reeds, and a pair of ducks cruised lazily by the shoreline. A perfect setting for an overnight retreat. Backing my Jeep up under a shade tree, I laid out my gear. A one-man pop-up tent, Coleman stove, a folding table and chair, cooler loaded with ribeyes, eggs, and a few cold beers. Nothing fancy, just what a man needs to escape the world and not think about precinct politics, budget meetings, or city council noise for a while. As I worked, I thought about the irony of it all. Most people picture a police chief sitting behind a desk all day, buried in paperwork. And truth be told, that's what a lot of my job had become. But under the uniform and title, I'm still the same guy who grew up baling hay and fishing in stock ponds. This land, bought with my savings, not some big pension, was a promise to myself that I wouldn't forget who I was, that I'd still have a place to breathe when the world got too noisy. Once the tent was staked and the fire pit set, I pulled out my old cast-iron skillet and prepped dinner. Nothing beats a good steak cooked over mesquite coals, seasoned with salt, pepper, and that smoky Texas air. As the meat sizzled and the sun dipped low, I sat back and took it all in. The stillness, the sense of accomplishment. For a moment, it felt like time had finally slowed down. That's when the first interruption came. A black drone buzzed overhead, small, fast, and intrusive. It hovered for a few seconds, clearly scanning, then zipped off. I frowned. I hadn't seen any other vehicles or people nearby. Who would be flying a drone out here? I shrugged it off, thinking it might be a nosy neighbor's kid or some tech hobbyist who wandered too close. Still, it was unsettling. Privacy is hard enough to come by in the city. I didn't expect to lose it 40 miles outside of town. Half an hour later, while I was flipping the last steak, I heard a vehicle. A black SUV slowly crawled down the long gravel path that led to my lake. Now, that was unusual. I hadn't given anyone access, and my property line was clearly marked. My gut told me this wasn't a friendly check-in. As the SUV rolled closer, I could already spot the magnetic logo on the side door. Twin Pines Property Management. My heart sank a little. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew exactly what was coming. HOA drama. See, technically, Twin Pines was the nearest gated community about a half-mile up the road. Cookie-cutter homes, trimmed hedges, and an obsession with rules. I'd heard rumors they were expanding their visual footprint, meaning they wanted nearby properties to align with community standards. In other words, they wanted control over places they didn't own. I hadn't given them much thought. My ranch was outside their jurisdiction. No dues, no shared roads, and certainly no agreements. But from the determined look on the woman who stepped out of that SUV, clipboard in hand and lips pursed like she just smelled bad cologne, I knew they thought differently. "Hello," she said sharply, barely looking at me. "I'm from the Twin Pines Homeowners Association. We've received complaints about unauthorized use of this property." I wiped my hands on a towel, careful not to lose my calm. "You're standing on land owned by Marcus Ellis. That's me. What complaint could possibly apply here?" She didn't even blink. "Camping structures and open fires are prohibited in the extended buffer zone of Twin Pines Lake District." I raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, this is Ellis Lake. I own this land, the water rights, and everything from the gate to the ridge." She seemed unmoved. "I understand your belief, but our records show an updated zoning overlay that includes this parcel within the Twin Pines Lake Visual Corridor. I stared at her, stunned at the absurdity. Visual corridor. By the time the HOA rep retreated back to her SUV, I figured the incident was over. I figured wrong. What I didn't know was that her visit was just the opening move in what would become an absurd tug-of-war over land rights, personal space, and authority. In hindsight, I should have expected more trouble. It's rarely just one conversation with people like that. When someone walks up with a clipboard and confidence built on bylaws, they don't stop until they've either won or been told off in writing. The very next morning, I received a notice taped to my ranch gate, a thick envelope sealed in plastic and zip-tied to the fence like some kind of bureaucratic ransom note. It contained what the HOA called a formal notification of non-compliance, complete with color photos of my tent, fire pit, cooler, and even my camping chair. They had printed out aerial drone images highlighting my gear with bright red arrows and notes like unauthorized structure and unsightly obstruction. I couldn't help but chuckle. They actually listed my fold-out chair as a violation of landscape harmony. I didn't know if I should laugh or be insulted. I knew I could ignore it. Legally, they had no claim, but part of me couldn't let it go. This was my land. I worked my whole career to get to the point where I could own something like this, something peaceful, away from noise and nonsense. And here I was being treated like a squatter by a committee that couldn't even pronounce the name of my lake correctly. The following week, things escalated. First, it was the signage. I returned from a long shift at the precinct to find a fresh, private property, HOA oversight area sign staked near my main entrance. Not only was it illegal to post signs on land they didn't own, but they had the audacity to include a QR code linking to Twin Pines community regulations. Then came the emails. Somehow they had tracked down my city-issued email address and flooded it with urgent notices demanding I cease non-conforming activities. One message ended with, "We're willing to avoid legal action if cooperation is received promptly." Legal action. For camping on my own dirt. I called the HOA office myself, hoping a rational voice on the other end would realize the mistake. Instead, I was routed to the same clipboard warrior from before, a woman named Rhonda Shelton, the self-appointed head of visual compliance enforcement. She didn't skip a beat. "Chief Ellis, I'm glad you called. I assume this means you're ready to resolve the matter and come into alignment with the community code." "Rhonda," I said, barely hiding my irritation, "you're not my HOA. You're not my anything. I live and own property outside your jurisdiction." She sighed dramatically. "Chief, the lake is considered part of the Twin Pines Visual Basin. We have every right to preserve the environment in a way that supports neighboring property values." I laughed. "My land isn't part of your neighborhood. It's part of my retirement. If you don't want to look at a tent, don't fly drones over my lake." She didn't appreciate that. That weekend, they sent someone to install a small security camera on a nearby tree just outside their boundary line, angled toward my dock. It was subtle, but not enough to go unnoticed. They were watching, waiting, hoping for another excuse to complain. I'd seen plenty of neighborhood squabbles in my years as a cop, people arguing over fences, lawn height, barking dogs. But this wasn't about noise or trash or danger. This was about ego. The HOA didn't like the idea that someone they couldn't control had land next to theirs. Worse, that I wasn't intimidated by their policies. That's the thing with people who cling to power they didn't earn. They push until someone pushes back. And I was ready. I gathered every document I had, land deeds, zoning maps, city records, and filed a formal cease and desist to the HOA. I also notified the county assessor's office and made sure that any future encroachments, signs, or surveillance equipment placed on or facing my property would be documented and responded to legally. I even installed my own cameras, not because I felt threatened, but because I knew how these things go. People who feel entitled to control don't back off easily. Sometimes they escalate until they cross a line they can't walk back from. And given who I was, not just a property owner but the chief law enforcement officer of the very city they called for backup, I had both the patience and the authority to make sure they learned that lesson the hard way. I just didn't expect they'd test it so soon. It was just after sunset when I noticed the lights, blue and red bouncing off the trees, slicing through the quiet like a disco from a bad memory. I'd just finished cooking a skillet of potatoes and sausage over the fire when I saw the telltale flash up the gravel road that led to my lake. At first, I thought maybe one of my deputies had swung by, curious after hearing the HOA rumors making the rounds. Then I saw the cruiser. It wasn't county, it wasn't city either. At least, not one I recognized immediately. The logo on the door belonged to the Regional Sheriff's Auxiliary, a unit that handled rural civil complaints when jurisdiction got fuzzy. That meant someone, somewhere, had pushed the right buttons to get an official response. And I had a feeling I knew who. Two deputies stepped out, one older and clearly in charge, the other younger and trying too hard to look serious. They approached slowly, hand on belt but not on weapon. That was good. At least they weren't expecting a fight. Still, there was tension in the way they moved, like they were walking into something they didn't fully understand. I stood up and greeted them by name. I'd met the older deputy, Jim Harrow, at a mutual training event a few years back. We weren't close, but he'd know who I was. He raised an eyebrow when he got a good look at me in the firelight. "Well, I'll be," he said, chuckling under his breath. "Chief Ellis?" "In the flesh," I replied, wiping my hands on a towel. "Didn't expect company tonight. What brings you out this far?" He exchanged a glance with the younger deputy, then pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "Got a call from the Twin Pines HOA. Said there was someone trespassing and possibly squatting on private community lakefront." I whistled low. "That's a new one. Care to see my deed again?" He laughed and waved the paper. "Not necessary, Chief. We've already confirmed your ownership on file. But we had to respond. They insisted it was an ongoing enforcement concern and that you'd been warned multiple times." I raised an eyebrow. "Warned? Jim, they've been leaving letters, signs, and now apparently calling in outside law enforcement to push their agenda." He nodded, his expression shifting to something more serious. "Look, off the record, we both know this is harassment. But legally, as long as they stay off your land and don't physically interfere, they're walking the edge of civil nuisance. They're hoping to provoke something, anything, to escalate." I sighed and looked out over the lake, where the reflection of the patrol lights danced like flames on the water. They sent a drone, posted signs, even tried to install a camera near my dock. "Camera?" The younger deputy spoke for the first time. "On your land?" "Just off it," I replied, but pointing directly at my campsite. "I've already documented it and filed a cease and desist with the county recorder's office." Jim shook his head. "This whole thing is out of hand. Most HOAs just harass folks over mailbox colors. These people are weaponizing procedure." "And when procedure doesn't work," I said, "they're hoping to catch me in a moment of frustration." He looked me in the eye. "You planning to give them that?" "Not a chance," I said, crossing my arms. Jim chuckled again. "Didn't think so. Well, unless they make a formal civil claim, which'll go nowhere, we won't be back out here for this nonsense, but keep your cameras rolling just in case." "Always do." Before they left, Jim offered a final warning. "Watch your back, Marcus. They're not used to someone who can outmaneuver them. That kind of frustration tends to stir up creativity or pettiness. As the cruiser pulled away, I stared into the fire and chewed on his words. It was true. This wasn't just about a tent or a view. This was about control. And when people like the HOA couldn't get what they wanted through intimidation or paperwork, they often turned to sneakier tactics. But I wasn't rattled. I wasn't some rookie camper trespassing on a whim. I was the chief of police, and I knew exactly how to handle bullies who thought they could rewrite the rules. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. You'd think after a visit from uniformed officers, a stack of official documents proving ownership, and a direct conversation with the chief of police, most people would back off. But no, Rhonda and her HOA crew weren't most people. They saw the law not as a boundary, but as a puzzle. And to them, I wasn't a property owner or a neighbor. I was an obstacle to be maneuvered around. The next Saturday morning, I decided to head back out to the lake with my teenage son, Connor. He'd been wanting to fish, and I figured it was a good chance to teach him how to cast and enjoy a screen-free afternoon. We loaded up the Jeep with tackle boxes, snacks, and a couple of camping chairs, and hit the road by 7 a.m. The ranch looked peaceful when we arrived. Morning mist skimmed the surface of the lake, and deer tracks dotted the path down to the dock. But before we even unloaded the rods, I spotted something odd, a sign posted just inside my fence line. I climbed out, walked up to it, and stared in disbelief. It read, "Notice: this area falls under visual compliance rules established by the Twin Pines Homeowners Association. Camping and outdoor recreational use may be subject to restrictions. Violators may be subject to civil action." The audacity. This time, they didn't just post near the boundary. They'd stepped onto my property, stuck a stake into my soil, and claimed authority. My son came up beside me, squinting at the sign. "Are they allowed to do that?" he asked. "No," I said flatly. "They're absolutely not." I yanked the sign out of the ground and threw it in the back of the Jeep. Enough was enough. I wasn't going to play defense anymore. I made 2 phone calls, one to the county land office and the other to a city councilman I trusted. And then I got dressed, not in jeans and boots, but in full uniform. See, up until now I'd been handling things casually, off-duty, relaxed. But clearly the HOA needed to be reminded, visually, publicly, and unmistakably, who they were dealing with. I returned to the ranch late that afternoon in my city-issued vehicle, in full-dress blues, with my badge visible and my title pinned squarely on my chest. Chief of Police, City of Fairhaven. I wasn't coming in hot. I wasn't there to intimidate. I just wanted the truth to stand in plain sight, so there'd be no room for misinterpretation. I didn't have to wait long. As I was walking along the dock with my clipboard, yes, I brought my own, a white Lexus SUV rolled slowly down the gravel road. I could practically hear the HOA board meeting music playing inside it. The car parked, and sure enough, out stepped Rhonda Shelton, clipboard in hand, heels entirely unsuited for dirt roads. She froze when she saw me. Her eyes scanned the uniform, the badge, the car behind me. "Chief Ellis," she said slowly, as if trying to decide if I was wearing a costume. "That's right," I said with a slight smile. "Nice to see you again, Miss Shelton. I wasn't aware you were officially law enforcement. Then maybe you should have done your research before trying to claim regulatory oversight over a law enforcement officer's private property." Her mouth opened, then closed. "This isn't about you personally. It's about standards." I stepped forward, firm but calm. "Rhonda, you've harassed me, posted false claims, called in unwarranted complaints, installed surveillance, and now you're trespassing. That sign from earlier was placed a full 20 feet inside my deeded property line. You were just testing boundaries. I get it. But now you've reached the legal kind. Any further action from your HOA will result in formal complaints. Not just civil, but criminal if you or your board step on this land again without permission. She swallowed hard. I see. I hope you do, I said, pulling a sealed folder from my clipboard. This is a courtesy packet. It includes maps, my deed, a formal cease and desist letter, and a signed affidavit from the county surveyor confirming this property falls entirely outside the Twin Pines HOA boundary. Deliver it to your board. And next time you feel like testing authority, check the badge first. She said nothing, just took the folder and turned slowly back toward her car. As she drove off, I finally felt it. That quiet again. Not just the absence of sound, but the return of something deeper. Ownership, peace, control of my space. And my son, who'd watched the whole exchange, looked up at me and said, "That was kinda awesome." Yeah, it was. The next morning, I was sipping coffee on my porch back at home when the calls started. First it was my assistant, then a councilman, then a reporter from the local paper. Apparently, word had gotten around. Rhonda, it seemed, had wasted no time informing the Twin Pines HOA board that I wasn't just some belligerent landowner camping illegally on their precious visual corridor. I was the chief of police for the entire city of Fairhaven, and that changed everything. Suddenly, the tone of the emails I received from the HOA shifted from aggressive to cautious. Instead of warnings and veiled threats, they were full of language like seeking clarification, hoping for mutual understanding, and committed to cooperative dialogue. Funny how fast a little authority shuts down arrogance. Still, I decided it was time to put this whole mess to rest the right way, publicly, transparently, and with no room left for confusion. That afternoon, I called a community meeting. I didn't need to, legally, but I figured if Twin Pines wanted to play in the realm of procedure and formality, I'd beat them at their own game. I invited county zoning officials, a few city legal advisors, and even a representative from the State Land Commission to join. The goal wasn't to gloat. It was to draw a clear line in front of witnesses so no one could claim ignorance again. The meeting took place at a small hall just down the road from the lake. Twin Pines showed up in force. Rhonda, 3 board members, their private attorney, and a handful of curious residents. Most of them wore that overly practiced smile I'd come to recognize from years dealing with entitled bureaucrats, polite on the outside, seething just below the surface. I stepped up to the podium, dressed in my uniform, with a stack of documents in hand. "Good evening," I began, voice calm but firm. "For those who don't know me, I'm Chief Marcus Ellis, head of the Fairhaven Police Department. I'm also the sole owner of parcel number 486-237, known to most of you as..." It's a strange thing, watching an HOA try to act like a sovereign government. They hold meetings like Congress, enforce rules like deputies, and write citations with all the drama of a courtroom summons. But here's the thing about power. It only works where it's allowed. And once you cross that invisible line from regulation to domination, you're bound to run into someone who pushes back. And that someone this time happened to be the law itself. After the community meeting, I figured the message had landed. And for a short while, it had. The HOA went quiet. Rhonda retreated, and there were no new signs, drones, or complaints. But silence in HOA land isn't always surrender. Sometimes it's strategy. About 2 weeks later, I received a letter, official, sealed, and delivered by courier. This wasn't from Twin Pines directly. It was from their attorney, a firm out of Austin with a reputation for stretching land use laws like taffy. The letter was written in that kind of polished, condescending legalese you'd expect from someone who thinks property ownership is a technicality, not a right. In short, it claimed Twin Pines was exploring legal remedies to prevent environmental degradation and community value depreciation due to my activities on the land. Translation: they were trying to sue me for camping on my own property because they didn't like the look of it. The letter cited obscure provisions from a regional environmental overlay plan that hadn't been updated since the Bush administration. They claimed the lake, Ellis Lake, fell within a scenic corridor that required special care under county advisory guidelines. Not binding law, mind you, guidelines, voluntary ones at that. I knew exactly what they were doing. It was a scare tactic. They hoped I'd see the legal jargon, the footnotes, the fancy letterhead, and panic. Maybe even cave. What they didn't expect was that I had friends in both the sheriff's department and the county attorney's office. So I called in a favor and had the claims reviewed immediately. 2 days later, the county sent me a written statement. The lake was privately owned, fully outside any scenic easement, and not subject to any environmental overlay enforcement. In simpler terms, I was free and clear. Still, I wasn't going to play defense forever. The moment HOAs start trying to enforce laws that don't exist, they create more than conflict. They create precedent. And in my position, I couldn't let that go unchecked, so I decided to take it public. I scheduled a guest appearance on the local AM radio show, one of those call-in segments that the ranching and rural community loved. I didn't name names, but I talked about the increasing issue of HOAs attempting to stretch their authority beyond legal bounds. "You've got these boards," I said on air, "elected by a handful of residents, acting like land czars. They think because they manage a few streets and enforce lawn care rules, they can tell someone a half-mile down the road what kind of chair to sit in." The calls flooded in, story after story. People being fined for leaving a kayak out, forced to paint their homes a shade darker because of visual harmony. One woman told me they cited her for drying clothes outside. It was clear the issue wasn't just mine. HOAs in many places had stopped serving communities and started controlling them. And when you give people unchecked authority, you end up with situations like mine, where a board thinks they can rewrite property lines and challenge a police chief over a tent and a fire pit. That radio show lit a spark. A local journalist followed up with a column. Then a blogger picked it up. Before long, a quiet little HOA spat turned into a broader discussion on property rights. And just like that, Twin Pines had stepped on a rake. They'd gone from quiet community enforcers to the poster child of suburban overreach. They backed off after that, not out of grace, but out of exposure. Rhonda disappeared from public view, and their legal team quietly withdrew their exploration of remedies. No apologies, just retreat. The war, it seemed, was over, but I knew better. These weren't the kind of people who forget. They were the kind who bide their time, update their bylaws, and wait for the next angle. Fine by me. I had my cameras up, my documents filed, and a fresh stack of firewood by the lake. They wanted a power struggle, but I had something stronger. The law. It's funny how something as small as a tent beside a lake can turn into a lesson in civics, law, and human nature. If you told me a few months ago that my weekend camping trip would turn into a territorial standoff with a homeowners association, I'd have laughed and asked what you were drinking. But here we were, wiser, wearier, and with a few important takeaways etched into the dirt along the shores of Ellis Lake. After the smoke settled and the HOA went quiet, I found myself reflecting more on the deeper meaning behind the entire ordeal. This wasn't just about property lines or the legality of campfires. It was about respect, for boundaries, for rights, and for the people behind the paperwork. Rhonda and the Twin Pines HOA didn't start a fight because they had a genuine concern about safety or environmental integrity. They started it because they were uncomfortable with what they couldn't control. It's a tale as old as time. Someone sees something that doesn't fit their idea of normal, and instead of asking questions, they pull out a rule book. What the HOA didn't seem to grasp, or perhaps chose to ignore, was that boundaries aren't just lines on a map. They're a matter of principle. My land wasn't an extension of their subdivision. It wasn't a project to be cleaned up, tamed, or molded. It was mine. Legally, personally, spiritually. That's something folks forget when they get too wrapped up in regulations. Rules are fine when they serve a community, when they protect people and promote fairness. But the moment they become tools for bullying, they lose their purpose. And that's exactly what I saw happen in Twin Pines. Rules being used not to help, but to dominate. There's an important distinction between authority and power. Authority is granted by law, by consent, by trust. Power, on the other hand, can be taken, abused, and misused. The HOA had power, sure, but they didn't have authority over my land, and once I reminded them of that, their grip slipped like sand through fingers. But I wasn't blameless in all of this, either. In hindsight, maybe I underestimated how seriously these folks took their bylaws. Maybe I could have posted clearer signage or had a conversation earlier before they ever sent a drone my way. It's easy to assume that owning land means isolation, but in today's world, neighbors are rarely just a fence away. Sometimes they're watching from half a mile with binoculars and a rulebook. Still, the biggest lesson I walked away with wasn't about property. It was about patience. There was a time in my younger days when I might have reacted emotionally, marched over to Twin Pines with a citation book, maybe thrown my title around to scare them off. But leadership, real leadership, requires more than rank. It requires discipline. Had I lost my temper or made the feud personal, it would have spiraled into something uglier, and I would have lost credibility. Instead, I let the facts, the law, and time do the heavy lifting. And as frustrating as that was, it paid off. One afternoon, a man from Twin Pines drove up to the edge of my ranch. I recognized him from the meeting, a board member, I think, though not one of the vocal ones. He stepped out, hands open, no clipboard in sight. "I just wanted to say," he began, "that a few of us, we didn't agree with how things were handled." I nodded, letting him speak. HOAs are supposed to keep things peaceful, not pick fights. You didn't deserve what happened, and for what it's worth, I'm glad you stood your ground. That meant more than he probably realized, not because I needed the validation, but because it showed that respect, when earned honestly, sticks. So what did I learn? That fences may make good neighbors, but boundaries, the invisible kind, make honest ones. That when people fight for control, it's usually because they fear what they don't understand. That it's possible to hold your ground without drawing your weapon. And maybe most importantly, that even in a world filled with red tape and fine print, common sense and respect still matter. The lake hasn't changed, the trees still rustle, the water still reflects the sky. But I see it differently now, not just as a retreat, but as a reminder of everything I've stood for my entire career. Justice, patience, and a damn good reason to build a fire when the sun goes down. After months of conflict, emails, legal letters, and late-night calls, there was something almost surreal about returning to Ellis Lake. It was like stepping into a different world, a sanctuary untouched by the chaos that had dominated my life for weeks. The sun was setting behind the pines, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple, the way it always had. But this time I felt a deeper sense of calm. The jeep crunched over the gravel as I drove down the familiar path, the scent of pine needles and damp earth filling the air. My son, Connor, was with me again, eager to fish and camp, and I could tell this trip meant more to him now, not just a weekend adventure, but a symbol of resilience. We arrived at the campsite, and for the first time in months, it was untouched. No signs, no drones, no mysterious footprints, just the soft whisper of the breeze and the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore. I unpacked our gear with a contented sigh. Connor helped set up the tent while I gathered firewood. As the flames flickered to life, I looked out over the water, reflecting the stars beginning to pierce the twilight. This place wasn't just land or water, it was a victory. Not over people, but over intimidation and disrespect. It was proof that patience, persistence, and knowing your rights could restore peace even in the most contentious situations. That night, around the campfire, Connor asked, "Dad, do you think they'll bother us again?" I smiled and shook my head. "I don't think so. They learned their lesson. Sometimes standing your ground is the best way to get respect." He nodded thoughtfully. "I'm glad we came back." We spent the next few days fishing, hiking, and enjoying the quiet. Without the shadow of conflict, the lake felt more like home than ever before. Wildlife returned to the area, the occasional deer drinking at the water's edge, birds singing in the trees, and even a family of otters playing nearby. It was a reminder that nature, much like people, thrives best when left to its own devices and respected. In the evenings, I reflected on the journey, the calls to law enforcement, the community meetings, the radio interviews, and the legal battles. Each step had tested my resolve and reminded me why I became a police chief, to protect, to serve, and to uphold justice. But justice isn't just about enforcing laws. It's about protecting the little things that make life worth living. A quiet lake, a peaceful campsite, a place where you can breathe freely without fear of unnecessary conflict. The next morning, as the sun rose over the lake, casting golden light across the water, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. This land wasn't just mine, it was part of a community, a shared heritage that deserved respect from all sides. And with that respect came peace. Packing up to leave, I took one last look around. The lake was calm, the forest alive, and my spirit at ease. I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, I'd always have this place, a refuge earned through patience, courage, and the simple right to be. The dust had settled, the legal letters archived, and the tension eased, but the experience left a mark, not just on the landscape of Ellis Lake, but on me, personally and professionally. As I packed up from my last trip to the ranch that summer, I knew the real work was just beginning. Because when it comes to property rights, community, and peace of mind, the fight isn't a one-time battle. It's an ongoing commitment. The conflict with the Twin Pines HOA wasn't unique. Across the country, homeowners associations have become small governments unto themselves, sometimes helpful, often overbearing. They can be guardians of neighborhood standards or agents of unnecessary control. For many, they provide structure and safety. For others, they represent a threat to personal freedoms and privacy. In my case, the lines were clear. My property was private, my rights intact, and my authority unchallenged. But that clarity came at a price. Sleepless nights, strained relationships, and the lingering worry that this might happen again, or that another HOA might try to assert similar control somewhere else. So I took action, not just for myself, but for others. First, I reached out to local and state lawmakers. I shared my story, highlighting how vague HOA regulations and overreach could infringe on property owners' rights. It sparked interest. I was invited to testify at a state hearing on HOA reform, alongside other property owners and legal experts. The goal: clarify HOA boundaries, establish fair enforcement standards, and protect private landowners from harassment. Second, I started a community initiative, Respect Boundaries. It wasn't just about my ranch or Twin Pines. It was about fostering understanding between HOAs and neighbors everywhere. We held workshops, created informational packets, and brought in legal advisors to help people know their rights and how to peacefully resolve conflicts. At these events, I met people with stories eerily similar to mine. Owners threatened with fines for planting native flowers, families cited for hosting birthday parties, seniors forced to remove personal items from their yards. Each story underscored a critical truth. Boundaries matter, but respect matters more. On a personal level, I also made sure to build bridges. I invited some Twin Pines residents, those who showed openness, to visit the ranch. I wanted them to see the land as I did, not a threat, but a neighbor with rights and responsibilities. Over coffee and campfires, barriers softened, conversations replaced confrontations. It was a slow process, but progress nonetheless. Professionally, the experience sharpened my perspective as a police chief. It reinforced the importance of empathy, communication, and education in law enforcement. People often resist authority not out of malice, but out of fear or misunderstanding. My job wasn't just to enforce rules, but to build trust. The ranch conflict became a case study for our department on de-escalation and community engagement. Looking back, the toughest part wasn't the legal wrangling or the HOA's antics. It was remembering that behind every complaint, every letter, every disagreement, there were people. People scared of change, protective of their homes, and sometimes misled by incomplete information. Moving forward, I carry those lessons with me. I remain vigilant, yes, but also patient and open. My land at Ellis Lake isn't just a property line on a deed. It's a symbol of what we all strive for: freedom balanced with community, rights balanced with responsibility. And as the chief of police, as a neighbor, as a landowner, I will always fight to protect what matters most: respect, peace, and the quiet joy of a fire crackling under the stars. Because at the end of the day, that's what makes a place home.